I'm Stephen Wynn. I'm here today to talk to the four leading candidates for mayor in San Francisco about how the arts can be nurtured and supported in these difficult economic times.
Well, let me just say, getting back into the mayor's race and learning about the incredible defunding of the arts has been a conversation in many places that I've gone. When I was president of the Board of Supervisors, the hotel tax was specifically for the arts. And as I understand it from all over the city, so much of the arts have been defunded from that particular hotel tax. I mean, from the artists out at Bayview Hunters Point to literally the street artists that were part of the legislation I did to allow the street artists, to the opera, ballet, fine arts museums. I'm really surprised at the amount of defunding that has occurred, and I thank God for our private patrons who can at least, not at least, but contribute to keep us going, at least in a San Francisco fashion. We are an art city, and the problem is when you have elected officials that don't understand that, then you're not going to get the needed funding for the smallest of the arts to the largest of the arts.
We're going to circle back to the hotel tax in a minute,
Okay.
because as you know, there's a proposal about that. But let me ask you sort of more broadly, in sort of these tough and divisive economic times when issues about housing and the homeless and all these other contending issues, how, in sort of in general terms, can we support and nurture the arts in this difficult time?
See, I believe the arts are part of a civilized society. So I don't think that, and because there is so much, I don't think that because there is so much homelessness, of which I am overly familiar with, which is why I'm in this mayor's race, because there's so much poverty, because there's so much drug abuse. In my opinion, that's all the more reason why we need more art, and more public art, and more of an escape for art, and more of an opportunity for everyone in San Francisco, from the poorest of the kids to the oldest of the kids, have an opportunity to go to our free museums, to go to the opera and the ballet. These are ways of experiencing life, no matter what situation you are in life. So, you know, we worked with the fine arts museums years ago to have a day for the homeless to visit our museums. And it was a fascinating day. So you can't ignore the arts. The whole world around you can be in chaos, but you can never, in my opinion, ignore the arts.
So it's not, I guess the question is, it's not a zero-sum game, is that if you take something away from here, it means you can't supply it somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely not. You can get funding for arts from many different sectors that you couldn't get for funding for any of the other issues.
For people who are maybe not so arts-oriented, what's the case really for the arts and why they're so important to San Francisco in sort of in broader terms, in terms of attracting visitors and those sorts of things? What's the real case for why the arts are so important here?
I immediately started smiling because in my case it's mental health. It's literal, I'm sorry, but that's, you know,
That's a strong case. That's a strong case.
If I
and
want,
not just your mental health.
I'm not kidding. I'll go to my Fraffalippi books just for an hour of, you know, it's uplifting. It's uplifting. And for our city, San Francisco's an iconic city. We are in a horrible situation right now with homelessness and this very serious shooting up of horrible drugs that could kill you all over our streets, okay? So it's really horrible. But we are an iconic city because we have fostered, in my opinion, everything from model cities in the 60s and 70s to the promotion of the fine arts and, you know, opera and ballet. That's who we are. And the minute you start taking away from those essential elements of what the great city is about, that's when you really start to lose your soul. And that's what's happening with so many poor people in our streets. And so in my opinion, when things are as bad as they are right now, that's when you have to pile on more of the arts and more of the opportunity for everybody to see and understand the arts and actually to have that escape, if indeed it's an escape as a passion, as it is for me.
Yeah, another issue that we haven't talked about on the other side is the cost of housing, which of course artists are famously not big earners.
Right.
I mean, those in Hollywood are, but they're the great exception. How do we, again, try to support artists living here and making this the iconic art city
Right.
that it is? They have to find some way to get a purchase on the cost of living here.
Yeah, well, you know something, I absolutely believe that there is nothing you can't do when you have the political willpower to do it. I just simply believe that. I mean, if you look at some of our former mayors, you'll see that things got done even in the hardest of times. From my dad, Joe Aliotto, to Mayor Moscone. I mean, these were things that were very, very important to them too. For that matter, Mayor Shelley, I mean, when things were flourishing. But the housing issue, Steve, I have to tell you, is without a doubt one of the toughest issues right now. What the city and county of San Francisco is calling affordable housing is $130,000 salary a year. That's not teachers, nurses, artists, educators of all types, emergency services in an earthquake city, police, fire. That's not what they get paid. And so there's a program that I absolutely love, which is similar to what we did in Bayview Hunters Point when we had the artist colony that you might recall that is no longer there. A lot of it has moved to Oakland and to the East Bay. But what we did to promote the arts was to give rent subsidies for artists. That's number one. Another one is a program that I really want to copy that's in San Jose. And that is 4 blocks from a hospital, they built a building of over 415 units specifically for nurses. Just nurses. And the rent was a percentage of your income. So the rent never changed. If you made $200,000 or $180,000 as a nurse, and then another person in the same building made $40,000 or $50,000, the percentage, 10, 15, 20% of your income was the same, so everybody could live there. Okay, so like an artist co-op.
I was going to say, can we do the same for artists?
Absolutely, absolutely. Absolutely. I not only can, but that's absolutely something I would do. I was really dismayed to see so many of our artists south of Market had been moved out, and so many at Bayview Hunters Point had moved out. And North Beach used to be full of artists and artist studios, and it's disappearing. Yeah. Everything from dance schools to singing to instruments. San Francisco, was the home of every major instrument in the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, from the accordion to the violin. And so we've lost a lot of that, and I think it would be really important to bring it back.
So part of one of my dreams is to really work on making sure that the larger institutions are consistently working and actively engaged with the smaller institutions. I mean, part of, the new generation of artists comes from the smaller institutions, and how do we open the doors of opportunity with the ballet, with the symphony, if it not for the relationships that exist between the smaller institutions. I mean, in fact, at the African American Art and Culture Complex, we would work with the ballet, we would work with the opera, we would expose young people to these opportunities so that they know if they decided to nurture their talent, they could do anything that they want in the arts. And I think it's an important thing to do as mayor is to nurture those relationships, to continue to bridge the gap and bring them together. The Arts Alliance is a perfect example of bridging that gap and coming together and talking about ways in which we can continue to grow financially support for the arts and have a thriving arts community on all levels. And I think as mayor, I will definitely be at the forefront of continuing to foster those relationships.
How does some of the arts issues that we're talking about play into some of the other issues that are going on in the city that are so prominent in people's minds? The cost of housing, traffic, transportation, the quality of our street life. How do those things become part of a complex in which the arts plays a role in that and is important and central to some of these other issues?
I think when you look at what we've experienced in San Francisco in terms of our housing crises and in terms of our decline in diversity and diversity, racial diversity, economic diversity, diversity in the arts, and the ability to find and locate artists locally that can participate in many of these arts projects that are funded through the city and other projects in San Francisco. I think the fact that we are having some challenges in the city means that we have to do a better job of making sure that arts are at the forefront of how we do business in San Francisco, more specifically how we provide housing to artists. And in fact, and I know I keep going back to the African American Art and Culture Complex, but when I was the director there, my dream was to build artist housing on that parking lot where it's a live-work kind of situation. We have examples of how that works at the old Goodman Building and places in San Francisco where you can create these incredible arts communities for the purpose of making sure that we maintain the diversity in the arts community in San Francisco. The Hunters Point Shipyard is another great example of bringing artists together with opportunity for the purposes of making sure they have a space. And part of having a great artist community is making sure that sometimes we are subsidizing those costs and we're working together to retain what we have. And it will take a lot of work and creativity, but I know that it's possible if we make the right decisions. And part of those decisions is really focusing on housing for artists and making sure that, for example, some of the challenges we've had in the past is really earmarking housing specifically for artists because of a lot of our housing laws, which means that most of the money would need to be raised privately for the purpose of protecting it as an artist community. And that does take a lot of work, but it's not impossible.
If you were to become mayor, what specific kind of initiatives might you pursue, or might you along these lines, or perhaps in other areas as well?
So I think some of the things I might pursue is specifically identifying locations that are underutilized sites where there is an opportunity to build housing and also privately fundraise for the purpose of building that housing. The other thing that I would do is make sure that we're increasing funding in our cultural equity grants because we also are discovering that there is somewhat of a lack of diversity in the distribution of grant funding in San Francisco, and I do think that when you look at how much money we pour into cultural equity grants, we need to increase the funding there, but more importantly, we need to make sure that there is an administrator that is working with our small institutions for the purposes of making sure that they're able to get grants, they're able to comply, and they have the support and resources necessary to comply with what the city requires, but at the same time producing the incredible magic that they do for us every day.
You've alluded to really public-private partnerships here several times now. I wonder how you make the argument broadly for those kind of partnerships, and really even more broadly than that, how you make the case that the arts are important, again, with all these other issues sort of contain. In other words, is this a zero-sum game where if you're putting money into things like homelessness or drug issues or traffic or public transit, does that necessarily take money away from the arts? How do you balance those kind of fiscal concerns and make the case that the arts are important in a broader way, that they're really an engine in some ways in the city?
And from my perspective, there is no trade-off. There is no this versus that or don't. I mean, here in the city, for example, between 2010 and 2015, for every 8 jobs we created 1 unit of housing, and we wonder why there's a housing crisis. And I think that when we talk about San Francisco and its diversity and its need to address issues around homelessness and housing and public safety and transportation, the arts fits right into all of those things. The arts changes lives. I mean, for example, I played in band in middle school. Now, if you didn't play in band, you weren't cool. And I wasn't, the most best behaving child, I admit it, but the first day that I was in band and I was talking too much, Mr. Martins, who was a band instructor, basically made me write lines. And he told me if I do anything wrong again, I won't be in band. I straightened up real fast because I didn't want to miss out on this opportunity. And I think, that really changed my life. And so part of, when we're looking at what we need to do in San Francisco as it relates to the arts, it's just a natural part of what we should be doing in our public schools, in our lives, in our city, for the purposes of producing, what we know is great. Not just what we see in terms of murals all over the city, which are incredible and make you smile, but also the next generation of artists, the artists who actually oftentimes get overlooked, making sure that they have a platform and opportunity. It's naturally who they are, and I think as a city, we will miss out on this incredible talent if we don't support it and nurture it.
I mean, you raise an interesting point, which is that the arts, among the other things that they do, is there's a kind of discipline. There's a kind of rigor of learning an instrument or learning your craft, whether it's visual art or dance or whatever's going on. It's important, isn't it?
Yeah, it's discipline. It also helps young people to work together. It builds self-esteem. I mean, I watched as kids who wouldn't even look me directly in the eye, turn into these superstars on stage when they performed. And what it's done to watch kids grow and blossom in something that they truly love and believe in, it is one of the most amazing things. And it also improves grades for kids who are actively engaged in the arts. It is something that we need to make sure that is really at the forefront of what we do in San Francisco, for sure.
Are there ways in which you can bring some of these values that the arts has, the discipline and the excitement and the sense of discovery, into a mayoral administration? Are there analogies between the arts and government, do you think?
Oh, always, because, for example, we had an exhibit, a Paul Robeson exhibit at the African American Art and Culture Complex called Revolutionary Artist. I mean, we're talking about a man who stood up to the powers that be, who was an incredible artist, who was an incredible singer, just talking about his journey and how, he was basically blacklisted and how he was treated throughout the course of his career, but he used his star power in the arts as a way to fight against injustice. And so arts definitely plays a role, in telling a story and being actively engaged in the world of politics. But, for example, as supervisor, I brought in the arts to our location, whether into my office. We have exhibits by a number of our artists in our community. We sell their art, and they get 100% of the proceeds, which I really care. We got to pay our artists too. But I just think that there's always a role. Anytime, for example, even a mayor is sworn in, they're looking for a great singer to sing the national anthem or great performances. Our choir, the girls' chorus, the boys' chorus, the gay men's chorus, all these great things are always sought after by people for so many incredible events. And so they don't just wake up one day and go out someplace and they're able to sing. They have to practice, they have to rehearse, they have to be disciplined. And there's just a lot of work that goes into that and a lot of support necessary to continue to keep that going. And so I think part of how that relates to politics, in order to produce good legislation, in order to produce good things for the city and county of San Francisco, there's a lot of work that goes into doing that as well, and hopefully doing something just as creative as we're able to do in the arts when it comes to producing the right kind of legislation for the purpose of addressing issues in our city.
Yeah, before we turn to the hotel tax fund, I wonder if you have other kind of specific proposals or ideas about how the arts might be promoted, or how you might continue to make San Francisco enhance or really embrace the idea of San Francisco as an iconic arts city. So much of what we hear about San Francisco nationally, internationally, is sort of furrowed brow, like what's happened to San Francisco?
Yeah.
How can the arts kind of be an emblem on the other side of that coin and indeed play into that?
So I think part of how the arts play a role is, for example, we're pushing in the Western Addition in the Fillmore community. We actually passed one of the first cultural districts in Japantown. Japantown is an incredible, iconic place in our city, a beautiful place that arts plays a role and is important in the performance with the festivals and all the things that occur there. And I think when we basically talk about visiting San Francisco and getting people to look at it as an arts destination, really taking what we do here and the different places that make us unique, and talking about the history and the culture. But arts and our murals and our performances play an important part of that. To visit San Francisco to see an amazing performance like Hamilton, or to come and see the Nutcracker during the holiday season and those kinds of things. I think that it's important to promote them, through SF Travel, and as a place that you would come and visit for San Francisco, because the first thing you do when you go to other places, you're looking for where you can see a great show, or how you can, see some kind of performance. And that is really what I think makes San Francisco a unique place, because we offer it all, from the small institutions at, Brava Theater or the Mission Latino Cultural Center, and all these places where on any given day you can see a local great performance, to a larger institution like the opera or the symphony or anything like that. We have a unique city with unique spaces for the purposes of attracting people from all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, one of the surprising things that I've learned over the years, and you know this as well, that San Francisco is not just a place that people happen to go to a show here. It's really a destination for the arts also. Our museums, the public performances, and as you say, the groups large and small, that tourism is really important. I mean, tourism and the arts are intricately linked together, and they really are a driver of economic well-being as well. And again, if there are other ways that you can think that that you might propose to enhance that that relationship with, particularly with the out of town or the out of city visitor. We often think of the arts are, indigenous and endogenous to San Francisco, but in fact it's drawing people from all over the world, really.
All over the world, but also all over the Bay Area. I mean, at SOMARTS, where they had this incredible art exhibit called The Black Woman is God, people came from everywhere, all over the Bay Area, thousands of people to see what this thing was all about. Incredible African American women who are incredible artists producing such an amazing show. One night, everyone came dressed in white, and to hear the music and to see the procession and to feel the energy and the love in the room, and how it just really made it clear that there's some kind of different energy right here at SOMARTS, this community art space with all these incredible women. I mean, it was transformative. And I think that what we can do as a city is making sure that we shine a light on both the large and small and medium-sized institutions, and these unique shows in neighborhoods can also play an important role in that.
Do you think it would be an important message on the hotel tax measure, for example, to have that pass with a unanimous vote? I mean, is that important too?
I think it's important, and I think it's possible, because again, we have, basically, I know I have been a strong supporter and protector of the existing arts funding in addition to an increase. And so that it could change with any person who's mayor. And I want to make sure that it's protected, because I come from that world where I counted on hotel tax money for the purposes of running a 34,000 arts facility in the heart of the Western Addition community during the time where we were dealing with some of the most challenging situations around gun violence and other issues. I mean, it was incredible. And just imagine if I had lost that funding at that time, what I wouldn't have been able to do to support the community. It's too important. And so whatever we need to do to protect it, I'm sure, as the president of the board or as the mayor, I'm sure that I could work with all of the Board of Supervisors members to come to an agreement that we could put on the ballot for the purposes of protecting it for generations to come.
I think about this all the time, because the arts is such a integral part of, I think, what makes a city great to live in. It's part of what makes it whimsical. It's part of what brings people together. And it's part of why you enjoy a city. So you want a city to be functional, but you also want people to love and enjoy the city that they're a part of. And I always joke with my friends who don't understand what I do that I work for quality assurance in a company, and my product is a city, and we are all users of this product. And my role is to make this the greatest product possible for everybody. And so part of it is just making sure it's functional. You need to run on time. You want to make sure that people have forms of transit that they can get to work and to school, and you want there to be housing and jobs. But you also want people to love and enjoy where they live. And I'm a lover of cities. I love visiting cities. I love traveling and seeing how different cities operate. But I think what I appreciate the most when I visit are the whimsical elements of cities. And the arts is such a key part of that. And I get the difficulty of funding the arts, because every year when I vote on the budget, we're voting on things like shelter beds and rent subsidies for families who are at risk of becoming homeless, and people who are sick, and seniors who need meals, and infrastructure that allows people to be safer when they walk and bike. And so the arts typically, to be honest, fall to the bottom of that list. But I've always had to be very thoughtful and intentional about making sure that we pass a balanced budget, because the arts also creates jobs, it drives our economy, and I think it contributes in many ways to things that are very difficult to calculate in dollar signs, but are so important to ensuring that San Francisco is a great city.
Yeah, well, you sort of anticipated my follow-up question, and that is, are there ways in which the arts contribute to the functionality of a city, that they're not merely whimsy, not that that's not important, but that they are really embedded in the core function of what the city is and what city government ought to be?
What people have always loved about San Francisco actually is that it's attracted artists and creative people. It's not that it's just a center for tech or for finance. It's that it has a creative spirit. And if you lose the artists and you lose the creative folks because they can't afford to live here, or we don't support or fund the infrastructure for that work, then you lose a big element of what makes people want to come and work and live in the city. which is the driver of our economy.
Is the cost of living here, artists don't often make a lot of money, some of the issues about life on the streets here, which have been difficult for some of the arts organizations, particularly in the Civic Center area and mid-market. Are there again ways in which the arts can sort of drive other issues that we're addressing about some of these other things?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a couple of things. I was so heartened when the arts community partnered with our homeless service providers in 2016 to put forward a dedicated set aside that would fund both arts programming and housing for homeless families. Homeless families are the fastest growing segment in our homeless count, not just here in San Francisco, but in New York City and LA as well. We have a huge moral conundrum in cities across the country when we can't afford to house our families that live and work in our cities. And second, I love organizations like Hospitality House that run free drop-in arts classes on 6th and Market, and anyone can come in. And one of the challenges for our neighbors that live on our streets is having a place to go and having a safe place to go. And then once they're in the space, actually having opportunities to thrive. And these art classes in the middle of the day are so heartwarming and refreshing. Anyone can walk in and you can draw, you can paint, you can design, and it's just an incredible program. And so those are ways that the arts community can partner to help solve some of our bigger issues here in San Francisco.
So I can refer back to some of my experience in public office. I arrived in Sacramento as a first-year assemblyman in January 2003, following my election in November of the year previous, and it was just on the heels of the dot-com bust. And the state lost an unimaginable percentage of its general fund. Most of it just from a single line item, capital gains taxes, because the stock market literally crashed, and so we were out so much money. And unfortunately, I won't get into it too much, but our tax structure is such that we are highly dependent upon top 1-2%. And you've got to go where the money is, especially in times of crisis. But that also means that we suffer when the stock market suffers. And so the legislature, and I was there then at the time, had to deal with a $20 billion budget deficit. And we have to, by law, balance our budget, unlike the federal government. And so we had to make horrible cuts. 50% of the entire budget, due to a formula, is spent on K through 14. So public education took a big hit, but then we had to cut social services, and we had to cut health care, and we had to cut all sorts of things. And one of the first things my colleagues thought of doing, this actually preceded me by a year, was the California Arts Council's budget. And of course, the Arts Council funds local schools and community-based nonprofits which provide art and music education. And traditionally, the legislature thinks of such funding as icing on the cake. So that's got to be the first to go. And they don't really think or have a knowledge base that, no, that is not icing on the cake. That is fundamental to what we need to be doing in terms of educating our next generation and our next generation of audiences. And so I don't know that a lot of policymakers recognize that if we're talking about sustaining major arts organizations, our ballet, our symphony, our opera, not to mention all the community-based, smaller budgeted grassroots organizations, they can only be sustained if we have an audience to sustain it. And we only have an audience if that audience has some familiarity and maybe hopefully some education from the earliest years that leads them to want to be an audience member, much less a sponsor or a patron. So everything begins to get wobbly and shaky when we do away with the Arts Council's funding. And we went from about $1 per capita, meaning about $40 million, out of the general fund for the California Arts Council down to $2 million. We cut 98% of its budget. And then, of course, we had to get creative. We did a license plate. How can we cobble together a few extra pennies? And we ranked 50 out of 50 states in per capita spending on the arts. New York State, $5 per capita. Minnesota, $4.50 per capita. California, entertainment capital of the world, 3 cents per capita. It's embarrassing
Right.
and tragic.
How is that story instructive going forward for you in San Francisco? How do you make the case that arts aren't the icing, but they're the yeast in the cake, as it were?
That's the word I was trying to find.
how do you make that case? What's the case for it, broadly?
Well, one of the benefits of the mayor's office is, of course, the bully pulpit. And so, yes, the mayor can lay it out for the voters, the taxpayers of San Francisco, and try and raise consciousness and also be present in a public way to sustain, and not just the major arts organizations, the community-based organizations, to show that the mayor understands there's a need for all of us to come together and do our part in sustaining these organizations, that we are the richer for it. We will be the poorer without.
Richer in what sense? Not just in terms of, you know, a more ideologically and emotionally and artistically richer community, but ways in which the arts are an engine of other things, that they interact
Like
with
the
other
economy.
issues. Exactly.
Yes.
What's the case?
Well, when you figure that our hospitality and tourists and convention business is a major driver of employment in the city, I think it's about 80,000, and entertainment, performance, museum, visual, literary, musical, dance arts are all a part of that. And when the Convention and Visitors Bureau, now San Francisco Travel, is promoting San Francisco as a destination spot, what do you think they're showing off? Exactly the organizations we're talking about. So it is real dollars and cents. So yeah, we suffer there, but then we also suffer in the formation and the building of a next generation of audience, and then also just all of the magical aspects, the ineffable aspects of the arts.
At a time when people are saying, gee, you know, we have to address the homelessness issue, we have the housing issue, we have the economic, inequality issue, we have the quality of street life, traffic, how does the arts take its place and play into some of those other issues?
So you could look at it from at least one of two ways. One way is it's in competition for all of these other major significant needs, or that it will help sustain us and help us make better decisions and have a greater sensitivity to the humanity of the decisions that we're making. So let's not think of it as competition, but enhancing our decision making.
Are there ways in which addressing some of those other issues in sort of practical, real terms, the arts can play a role in, for example, homelessness or the housing issue? I mean, certainly one issue for artists is that it's very difficult to live here. Artists don't make a lot of money, and so that
All of these dots are connected. All of these dots are connected. You're going to get me going now in my soapbox.
That's
but-
good. Get on it.
If we're talking about education, of course, how we're going to sustain our public education system and our public school system, we need teachers who can afford to live in our community. We need art teachers to be able to afford to live in our community. We need the arts organizations to be able to stay in our community. Where do these community-based organizations rent space? So everything is interconnected, and right now we have a real challenge. Not only, well, all of these arts organizations, they, by definition, are small businesses. I'm a small business owner here in San Francisco for 40 years, so I have a direct connection and sensitivity to the challenges that small business owners face, or those who run small businesses. And space, just where they can operate, is now a real question, and we see such an exodus to Oakland and other places in the East Bay. That's heartbreaking to see. At the same time, and this is a bit of a conundrum that no one has yet to explain, because we're really challenging the laws of supply and demand, that for thoughtful purposes and reason, we require all new residential developments to have ground floor retail. and we're putting up a lot of new residential developments. I'm just thinking in particular from Octavia Street to Castro Street on Upper Market, every one of those triangular spots that
Right.
used to be a
You're
gas station is
Right.
now a housing development.
Right.
They all have ground floor retail because you don't want people living on the ground floor and then having no street traffic. You want to draw people to these neighborhoods. You want to create new, vibrant, sustainable neighborhoods. So we put in ground floor retail. That's a good thing. But because of the way retail is changing right now, I know you would never do such a thing, but I understand that some people are making purchases online. What a strange thing to do.
Never me.
No. And there is a downside to that because what will become of our merchant districts if this trend, this phenomenon of purchasing everything out of convenience online continues to grow? They could be at serious risk. They're already in great challenge right now. And so mom and pop retails and other small enterprises have a real hard time paying the rents. Now you'd think with a glut of retail space on the market, the price would fall. It's not.
It's not happening.
It's not happening. And so we've got a lot of vacancy. One idea, and I think it's been used in Vancouver, for example, and I've heard this from a lot of leaders of merchant associations across town, that properties that are owned by out-of-town landlords, oftentimes they're insurance companies just investing their surplus dollars, their pension funds investing dollars, they will keep their spaces empty thinking down the road it'll only garner a higher price. So they can, it's a write-off.
Sit on it, right.
They sit on it, and all of this empty space, well, it's causing blight. So the city suffers, the neighborhoods suffer, and so you, out-of-town landlord, should pay a tax on it. And we can use that tax for a variety of things, but what if we use that tax to subsidize community-based nonprofit organizations, arts organizations, even some retail, for-profit retail, to help fill these spaces that are available? We don't want them to leave town and go to Oakland or some other place. We've got the space here. It's just not affordable right now. And these merchant leaders are also telling me that when the property is owned locally, it seems that the landlord is more willing to negotiate, to be able to work with an entrepreneur who can afford $2,000 a month, but not $5,000 a month. So there's a difference in a situation depending upon who owns the building. But I would be very open to, and you would have, devils in the details. Some thought would have to be put into how, in fact, we administer something like that.
Right.
How we would determine, did some landlord have the opportunity to rent, decided not to. But if you keep your place open, vacant for an extended period of time, I think you should be paying something back to the city. And I would love to see it go toward arts organizations, among others, to be able to stay in town.
All right. I mean, you use the word blight. I mean, it's not really a direct comparison, but I mean, classically, in places like Detroit, what starts to bring cities back like that is when the artists come in first.
That's right. That's right.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's not a direct analogy, but in a way, it's resonant with what you're talking about here.
I'm reminded of Richard Flores'
Right.
book, The Creative Class.
Right. Exactly.
That's what makes metropolitan areas attractive and vibrant.
Right. Are there areas of the city where you see potential for more of that sort of thing going on? Parts of town that you feel are sort of underused in that way, and that we might
Well,
particularly...
certainly that stretch of Upper Market, but it's not the only place where we're building. There are towers going up everywhere. And that's one of my criticisms of City Hall right now, is that it has not been negotiating as well as it should be on behalf of San Francisco. I think oftentimes it's negotiating on behalf of multi-billion-dollar corporations, and we're not getting what we, the city, should be getting out of some of these deals. And so if there's a tax break, like we saw for mid-market, that what are the community benefits? And what are the enforcements of those promised community benefits? And another thing I've been talking a lot about is enhancing local hiring. So you want a tax break to incentivize industry to come into a certain part of town. Well, that's all well and good, but what are we going to get out of it? Okay, there'll be new jobs created, but are all those new jobs going to be for people coming from out of town? What are San Franciscans getting out of it? And what are San Francisco organizations and the heart and the soul and the foundation of our city going to get out of it? I don't think we've been negotiating on our behalf well enough.